Today, we are undertaking a really monumental task. We're dissecting a body of thought that, honestly, according to leading scholars and activists, fundamentally changed how they understood history, political economy, even the concept of revolution itself.
It really did. People say, oh, this book changed my life, and they mean it.
We are looking at a text, a tradition really, that acts as a profound challenge to a lot of entrenched Western academic and political assumptions, particularly about where, true radical initiative actually comes from.
Absolutely. And I think it's impossible, really, to grasp modern decolonial or anti-colonial thought without engaging directly with this tradition. When we talk about a work changing lives, we're talking about something that completely repositions how you see global power dynamics. So our mission today is a rigorous exploration, a deep dive into the intellectual lineage known as the Black radical tradition. And specifically, its uncompromising critique of established universalist theories, especially Marxism, which it views as, well, fatally compromised, just insufficient for understanding global oppression.
Right, and the central concept, the thing that drives this whole body of work, is what the sources provocatively call racial capitalism. If you're approaching this for the first time, this is the intellectual flashpoint, isn't it?
Absolutely. We have to start right there. The central disruptive argument is that racism isn't just a social byproduct of capitalist exploitation. It's not some, regrettable cultural hangover that's just going to vanish once the economic base is perfected. No. Instead, this tradition posits that racism is intrinsic to capitalism's very genesis, its organizational structure, its perpetual expansion. The system developed, organized, and pursued essentially racial directions from the very beginning.
From the beginning.
Yes, and it acts as a profound historical agency. What this means, really, is that if you try to separate race from capital, you fundamentally misunderstand both. They're intertwined.
Okay, so let's unpack that first massive conceptual leap right there. The wholesale rejection of universalist theory. For, over a century, the main intellectual tool for challenging capital, whether in the U.S., Europe, the colonies, it was often defined by various kinds of Marxism, wasn't it?
Predominantly, yes. That was the go-to framework for radical thought.
But this deep dive into the material, it concludes that's not enough. Actually, it says it's fundamentally wrong just to try and reshape or reformulate Marxism to fit, say, the needs of a third world revolution.
The critique here is absolute. It really moves beyond just adaptation. It contends that all universalist theories of political and social order, from liberal democracy right through to classic European Marxism, they all have to be rejected.
All of them. Why? What's the common flaw?
Because, the argument goes, they all suffer from the same fundamental Western biases, the same flawed historical assumptions. And this radical assessment, it was articulated quite early on by figures like Harold Cruse. Back in 1962, in a really seminal critique, he argued that American Marxists failed precisely because they didn't grasp the essential bond, the shared historical political destiny between the Negro in America and the colonial peoples worldwide.
So it wasn't just a failure of organizing, like not getting enough people on board. It was a failure of analysis. Cruse was basically indicting American Marxists for an intellectual inability, right?
Yeah.
An inability to develop theories that held any real value for Black people in the U.S.
Exactly, because Black people in the U.S. were clearly experiencing an exploitation system that went far, far beyond simple wage labor dynamics. It was something different, something deeper.
And this leads us to what I find genuinely the most stunning structural insight in this whole section. The complete reversal of the traditional vanguard thesis.
Oh, yes. That's a big one.
Historically, European radicals just assumed, didn't they, that the success of socialism in the industrial West was the key, the prerequisite for emancipating colonial subjects.
That was the standard line, yes. The revolution starts here, then spreads out. But Cruse flipped this entirely. He looked around in the early 60s and saw the former colonies. He pointed specifically to examples like Cuba and China back then. He saw them as the true vanguard of the new socialist revolution. The initiative, the real motive force, had passed entirely to the colonial world.
Wow. So the revolutionary spark wasn't in the factories of Manchester or Detroit anymore. It was in the sugar plantations, the rice fields, the mines of the global South. That really places the entire Western intellectual tradition, especially its radical wings, in a kind of reactive position, almost irrelevant in a way.
That's the profound consequence, exactly. And this highlights what the tradition sees as Marxism's deep structural flaw. The argument is that Marxism contained inherent theoretical ideological weaknesses. Why? Because its origins were rooted in the same social forces, the same historical civilization in Europe that provided the very basis for capitalist formation in the first place. It was born, essentially, of the same cultural environment it was trying to critique.
Hmm. But okay, if Marxists were focused on challenging the economic system, the exploitation, why couldn't they see the massive role of global slavery and colonization? That seems like a huge economic factor to miss.
It does, doesn't it? But it comes back to that singular preoccupation. Marxism was intensely focused on the industrial and manufacturing centers of capitalism, the visible conflict. Factory worker versus factory owner. Proletariat versus bourgeoisie. And this focus meant it operated under what turned out to be a false presumption that the motive forces, the material forces for the whole capitalist system were located wholly and exclusively in Europe. The source actually calls Europe a fictive historical entity in this context, a closed system.
A fictive historical entity, meaning they analyzed Europe as if it just existed in a historical vacuum, completely independent of everything happening in Africa, Asia, the Americas.
Precisely that. They treated Europe like the self-contained box where internal class dynamics were the only engine driving history forward. And this structural blindness, well, it meant they were ignoring these vast, absolutely crucial, complementary economic forces.
Like what specifically?
Like the raw material extraction under brutal colonial regimes. The massive, unbelievable capital accumulation derived from the triangular trade. The way colonial profits literally underwrote European banks and insurance companies. The role of tropical resources, sugar, cotton, coffee, rubber, flowing directly into the European industrial base. If you actually excise the colonial contribution, all that non-wage labor, that racialized extraction, the European Industrial Revolution, the subsequent rise of global finance, it just doesn't make sense. The numbers don't add up.
So for anyone listening, especially students of decolonial thought, this is really the core lesson, isn't it? You can't start your analysis on the floor of the European factory.
You absolutely cannot. You have to start in the ship's hold, on the colonial plantation, in the mines. That's where the foundation was laid.
And this preoccupation, this European focus, led to a profound analytical inadequacy in interpreting history. The main mistake, then, was trying to interpret all of history solely through that one lens. The dialectic of capitalist class struggles, bourgeoisie versus proletariat.
Yes, seeing that conflict as the primary, the exclusive motor of change, that framework was just far too narrow. It completely failed to account for other essential, enduring dynamics, like the fact that slave labor persisted for over 300 years, running parallel to wage labor, complementing it, feeding it.
Parallel, not sequential, that's key.
Crucial. The relationship between the accumulation generated by the Atlantic slave trade and New World slavery and the subsequent rise of modern capitalism, that relationship was organic, foundational. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't a secondary effect you could just ignore.
And the moment you recognize that slave labor and wage labor were complementary, not separate stages or systems, the whole theoretical foundation of classic Marxism it collapses, doesn't it?
It really does. You realize that racial coercion isn't just some unfortunate social sin. It's an economic engine. It's built right into the blueprint of the system.
Which brings us squarely back to that core term, racial capitalism.
Exactly. The source defines it as the process by which the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions. And this structure, it operates as a permanent, systematic, historical agency. It shapes events.
Okay, now here is where the argument gets, I think, intellectually really complex.
Yeah.
And maybe most challenging to the way we usually learn history. We often think racism starts with enslaving non-Europeans, right? Like it was necessary justification cooked up for the Atlantic trade.
That's the common narrative, yes.
But this tradition argues something quite different. It says racism actually had its genesis inside Europe, in the internal relations of European peoples themselves. And this predates transatlantic slavery by centuries.
That is the essential radical insight. It's a crucial historical reconstruction. It argues that when Europe began its global expansion, it wasn't inventing some brand new ideology of difference out of thin air. It was globalizing its existing, entrenched, internal framework of difference, of antagonism. You just have to look at the medieval and feudal social order in Europe. It was constructed on these antagonistic differences between different strata of Europeans.
Well, hold on. How is that distinction racial? It sounds more like class stratification, nobles and peasants.
Well, it was a blend. It was class, absolutely. But it was also an early form of what we now recognize as racial thinking based on inherited ontological difference. Feudal nobility often considered themselves literally of better blood.
Better blood, like biologically superior.
In essence, yes. A claim of superior lineage, inherent purity compared to common people. And this idea was often bolstered by religious narratives. Commoners were sometimes said to be descended from Ham.
The son of Noah.
That's the one, who, according to a prevalent interpretation of scripture at the time, was condemned by Noah to slavery for a lack of filial piety. So this established a framework right there within Europe of inherited racialized difference used to justify domination.
Wow. So internal class contempt, justifying why one group of Europeans could dominate another, that created the sort of ideological toolkit that was later used for external oppression on a global scale. I remember the example of the Norman yoke myth being mentioned.
Ah, the Norman yoke myth. Yes, that's such a powerful cultural artifact showing this internal racialism at work. It persisted in England for centuries, right up until the 1840s. The core belief was that these perfect ancient English liberties had been violently stolen, filched from the freeborn Anglo-Saxon Englishmen by those invading Norman knights back in 1066.
So the ruling class were seen as fundamentally foreign, a different stock.
Exactly. It's a persistent, powerful, intra-European racial and class narrative used to explain domestic social hierarchy, oppression, injustice, all by claiming the rulers weren't really English in the same way.
Okay, but wait. If we trace these ideological roots back to medieval feudalism, doesn't that make the term racial capitalism a bit misleading? If the roots are feudal, cultural. How did capitalism not just, inherit this idea, but make it structurally intrinsic to its whole economic model?
That is the perfect question, because it highlights the crucial difference, the mechanism. Feudalism used these kinds of racialized differences primarily to maintain static political hierarchies, right? Blood rights, land ownership based on lineage. Capitalism, however, took that inherited ideology, that way of thinking about difference, and applied it dynamically to labor and value creation on a global scale. Capitalism's brutal genius was its ability to systematize racial difference as the primary means of extracting maximum profit.
How so?
Well, it absolutely required defining a huge portion of the global labor force as essentially non-human or disposable or fundamentally other. This was necessary to justify perpetual uncompensated labor chattel slavery being the most extreme form. And that uncompensated labor was a necessary component for the massive capital accumulation needed to fuel the whole system.
So it wasn't just prejudice, it was an economic necessity for the system as it was built.
Precisely. And this is why the Herrenvolk idea just exploded in the 18th and 19th centuries.
The Herrenvolk, the master race concept.
Exactly that. The notion of the heroic Germanic race, or the Anglo-Saxon race, was aggressively pushed by bourgeois ideologists across Europe, France, Germany, Britain, North America. This idea, often dressed up in Enlightenment language or pseudoscientific justifications, explained the supposed inevitability and the naturalness of the domination of some Europeans by other Europeans, and, by extension, the domination of the entire world.
It moved from a primarily religious justification to a more biological one.
Yes, making internal hierarchy seem natural, God-given, or nature-given, while providing the perfect framework for external conquest and exploitation. It was incredibly efficient, ideologically speaking.
So when Europe expanded globally, it already had this meticulously prepared intellectual infrastructure ready for dehumanization. And this process culminated in what the source calls the invention of the Negro.
Yes. And the source is very clear. The conception of the Negro required immense expenditure of psychic and intellectual energy in the West. This wasn't some casual observation or ascription. It was an active, obligatory intellectual exercise.
Why obligatory?
Because it had to be commensurate with the enormous economic importance that black labor power held for the emerging world economy. And to achieve this invention, the West had to actively conceal and erase history. The memory of Africa's actual significance for ancient Greece, for Rome, for Islamic civilization. It was practically eradicated from Western memory, from scholarship. It had to be.
To create this blank slate.
Exactly. So this newly conceived creature, the Negro, was defined as non-traditional, dumb, and animal laborer. Perfectly designed conceptually for total exploitation.
A cultural and historical erasure that was actively maintained because the whole system depended on it.
Absolutely. And the conceptual precedents, the ways of thinking, were already there inside Europe. The Negro precedents were found in existing racial fabrications used to conceal the origins and justify the exploitation of the Slavs. Remember, that's where the word slave comes from.
Yeah.
And also the Irish and other marginalized European groups. The internal racialism and class contempt within Europe created the ideological space, the psychological groundwork necessary for these external racial systems to take hold so powerfully.
Okay, shifting gears slightly to labor mobility.
Yeah.
How did this sort of racial mist, as the source calls it, settle over the working classes in places like the U.S. and England, often dividing potential allies.
Well, the formation of the industrial cores, think England, the early U.S., consistently relied on these waves of migrant labor, didn't it? Flemish weavers, Huguenots fleeing persecution, then the Irish, Polish, Italian immigrants. In North America especially, the colonial capitalist class needed both the poor white immigrant and the African slave as laborers. And they found it politically extremely convenient to obscure the true origins of the dispossessed state of both groups.
How did they obscure it?
By selectively lifting that intra-European racialism and class contempt, the very things that could have potentially united poor Irish immigrants and enslaved Africans in opposition, that sense of shared oppression was deliberately fractured. Instead, most of the poor European immigrants were gradually, unevenly embraced into a category of whiteness, forging the basis for the powerful myth of white solidarity.
A myth specifically designed to obscure shared economic oppression by emphasizing racial difference instead.
Precisely. A myth designed to obscure the related but differentiated exploitations of African, European, Asian, and Amerindian peoples. That racial mist of European civilization, as the source puts it, settled over the colonies. It created these rigid, hierarchical racial categories specifically designed to ensure the ideological foundations of racial capitalism remained unchallenged by any kind of unified cross-racial working-class movement. The structural reality of capital demanded blackness at the absolute lowest stratum, period.
Okay, so we've established the critique of universalism and the concept of racial capitalism. Now, the true test of any political theory, surely, is its ability to inspire and sustain actual resistance.
Indeed.
And the power of this black radical critique lies in the fact that it claims to be grounded in centuries of successful, independent resistance. Not just theory, but practice.
Exactly. And this is a vital distinction, particularly for anyone studying resistance movements today, where European socialism often viewed the proletariat quite abstractly, almost like an instrument to achieve a predetermined theoretical goal.
A historical agent, but maybe not with its own consciousness prioritized.
Something like that. Black radicalism, in contrast, was defined from the outset by the actual consciousness, the actual lived activity of the masses themselves, their felt needs, their cultural imperatives.
The historical narrative of that resistance, it begins with a total rejection of their situation, right? Not just asking for better conditions, but rejecting the very status assigned to them.
A total rejection of their lot, yes. And crucially, this resistance was often powered by what the source terms metaphysics, not the material.
Metaphysics, not the material. We'll need to unpack that. But first, the initial response was often flight. Marriage.
Marriage, yes. Flight. This was often the initial and in many ways the most powerful and enduring response of enslaved Africans, running away, forming independent communities.
And these weren't just temporary hideouts in the woods, were they? The sources describe the establishment of autonomous, often long-lasting, political societies.
Absolutely not temporary. What the historical examples show us is the creation of entirely alternate, often successful political and economic paradigms. And significantly, these were often rooted in African political traditions and cosmologies brought over by the enslaved.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Take Mexico. In the late 16th century, there was a successful revolt led by Gaspar Yanga, said to be a Congolese chief, in the mountains near Mount Orizaba. His community fought off Spanish attempts to recapture them for decades, and they were so effective, so resilient, that the Spanish crown eventually had to grant them formal status as a free black settlement, San Lorenzo Cerralvo. That's an autonomous settlement, a palenque representing an immediate, sustained counterstate.
A recognized free black town in 17th century Mexico. That's incredible. And then there's the most iconic example, probably Palmares in Brazil.
Yeah.
Which wasn't just a village, right? It was essentially a decentralized, autonomous kingdom.
It really was. Palmares, a network of settlements or Colombos in the Pernambuco region of Brazil, was astonishingly organized and enduring. It was rooted in Congolese and Angolans social structures and cosmologies spanning most of the 17th century. They had elected officials, internal trade, agriculture, complex fortifications, and they survived numerous Portuguese military assaults for almost 100 years. Its final destruction in 1694 was celebrated throughout the colony as a victory on par with expelling the Dutch.
That tells you how much of a threat it was.
It tells you the severe ideological and political threat posed by a free, independent, successful black society operating completely outside the logic of racial capitalism.
And then there's Suriname, where the resistance was apparently so complete, so successful, it created a kind of nation within a nation, a structure that actually persists even today.
Yes. The Bush Negro tribes of Suriname, the Saramaka, the Juka, the Matawai, and others, they represent the most enduring and arguably the oldest examples of continuous marriage anywhere in the Americas. They waged intensive guerrilla warfare against the Dutch planters for decades in the 17th and 18th centuries, and they achieved formal peace treaties that recognized their autonomy, their territory. They were literally described at the time as a state within a state.
Wow.
Their ability to maintain political sovereignty, cultural continuity, often forcing European colonial powers to negotiate with them as equals, it just speaks volumes about the independent strength and viability of this radical tradition long before European theories arrived.
And all this resistance, this tradition of forming alternative societies, it surely reached its absolute zenith in the Haitian Revolution.
Without a doubt. The Haitian Revolution, from 1791 to 1804, remains a historical watershed, just monumental, and the single greatest political statement against racial capitalism in world history, arguably. It was the first and only slave society to achieve the permanent destruction of the slave system through its own internal revolution. And in the process, defeating the armies of the major European powers of the day, France, Spain, and Britain in sequence. The geopolitical and ideological shockwaves were just immense, felt globally.
Now, Toussaint Louverture, the famous leader, he was certainly someone who engaged with European thought. He read Caesar's commentaries, Reynal, which is the testament, I suppose, to the hybrid cultural lives these radical leaders often lived.
Yes, that's true. Leaders often drew from multiple wells.
But the revolution's engine, the driving force, it seems rooted in something much deeper than just applying European revolutionary theory, wouldn't you say?
Oh, profoundly so. It was powered fundamentally by African cultural and ideological materials. For instance, Islam served as a key tactical and strategic element among the Hausa and Nagos Yoruba peoples in the 1835 Bahia Revolt in Brazil, but more generally across the Americas, African religious forms, Obeah in the British Caribbean, Voodoo in Haiti, Maoism, Pocomania in Jamaica, these served as the core ideological basis for resistance. This resistance was predicated, as the source says, on a total rejection of their lot.
And that focus was on metaphysics, not the material. Can you elaborate on what that distinction really means in practice?
It means the struggle was first and foremost about ontological integrity, about cultural self-definition, about maintaining their identity as a people against a system designed to strip that away entirely. The belief in spiritual power, the connection to ancestors, the capacity for the human spirit to transcend the body's horrific conditions, sometimes even literal beliefs in the ability to fly home spiritually back to Africa. These metaphysical beliefs often sustain resistance more effectively than, say, purely individual material motives, like just wanting more food or less work.
So they resisted the philosophical degradation, the dehumanization, first and foremost?
Yes. The material fight for land, for freedom from the whip, eventually for wages, that was crucial, obviously. But it was often secondary to or intertwined with the fight for cultural survival as an African people. That ontological battle came first.
Okay. This cultural foundation, this different philosophical grounding, might help explain a really curious, persistent puzzle, one noted by Western witnesses throughout these centuries of conflict. The apparent lack of indiscriminate, vengeful violence often shown by the enslaved populations, even during massive uprisings.
It is genuinely one of the most remarkable and consistently overlooked observations in the historical record. Western witnesses, planters, officials, soldiers repeatedly remark that the enslaved blacks have seldom employed the level of violence that they, the Westerners, understood the situation required. They expected wholesale slaughter, and it rarely happened that way.
Right. When you compare the often focused, targeted violence of the enslaved aimed at property, symbols of power, specific overseers, to the massive, indiscriminate, institutionalized terror used by the master class in reprisals, the difference is incredibly stark.
It really is.
We see this in specific examples cited in the sources. Nat Turner, who led a bloody revolt, still apparently spared some poor whites who owned no slaves. Toussaint Louverture famously escorted his former master's family to safety at the start of the Haitian Revolution.
Exactly. Or look at the massive Jamaican Baptist War uprising in 1831. It involved perhaps 300,000 enslaved people against maybe 30,000 whites. The planters were convinced of impending total slaughter, yet the actual number of recorded white casualties was incredibly low, maybe 14 people. The violence was overwhelmingly contained and targeted toward the symbols and institutions of the slave system, plantations burned, machinery destroyed, not indiscriminate killing of the white population.
Which suggests, as the source puts it, a very different and shared order of things among these African peoples, a different ethical or cultural framework regarding violence and conflict compared to contemporary Europe.
Precisely. A framework contrasting sharply with the history of Europe, which the source rather starkly describes as an almost uninterrupted chronology of fratricidal warfare and its celebration.
Fratricidal warfare and its celebration. That's a strong statement.
It is, but the argument is that for far longer than a millennium, conflict resolution in many African societies often prioritized other means: migration, resettlement, negotiation, ritualized contests, where total warfare and the celebratory slaughter of opponents were perhaps less central than they became in European civilization, particularly from the medieval period onwards. This deep cultural persistence, this different order of things, informed the resistance ethic in the Americas.
Okay, so we have this deep, culturally rooted tradition of resistance. But for it to evolve into a coherent intellectual tradition, it required its own thinkers, its own theorists. And often these emerged from the black middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie in colonial territories.
Yes, this group occupied a really complex and often conflicted space. They were often defined, initially, by their ability to absorb European culture and language. The sources use the term deracination, pulling up roots, to describe this process. And sadly, the extent of this deracination, how well they mastered European ways, often became the measure of their civility and, in the eyes of the colonizers, their supposed loyalty to the empire.
A very precarious position. They served as intermediaries, didn't they, between the vast black laboring masses and the white-dominated world system.
Exactly. They received enough education to grasp the theoretical tools of European thought, liberalism, socialism, nationalism, but they were constantly, systematiquement, rebuffed by the white ruling class whenever they tried to fully claim the status, the equality implied by that education. It was a constant source of frustration and alienation.
So when they were repressed or denied the rights they felt they had earned through assimilation, what was their typical political response?
Well, initially the response was often one of supplication. Writing petitions, appealing to the conscience of the empire, arguing for inclusion based on shared British or French values, trying to prove their worthiness. But when that inevitably failed or proved insufficient, some within this intelligentsia developed a reaction that could become, as the source puts it, mystically chauvinist. An elitist consciousness of race, sometimes romanticizing a lost African past or asserting inherent black superiority as a counterweight to white supremacy.
This also led to a kind of desperate, necessary invention of black history, didn't it, as a direct challenge to the dominant narratives.
Yes, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it became crucial to establish a counterhistory, serving as a dialectical negation of the national myths that erased or denigrated Black people. You think of figures like George Washington Williams, whose massive 1882 History of the Negro Race in America was this monumental effort to establish achievement for achievement, civilization for civilization, directly challenging the American myths that denied any significant African past or contribution.
This whole intellectual and psychological dilemma seems beautifully captured in the personal journey of someone like C.L.R. James. As a colonial subject in Trinidad, he was apparently utterly immersed in English middle-class culture.
Oh, James's trajectory is just a classic, powerful example of what the source calls the tragic mistake of colonial identity. As a young Trinidadian colonial, he was brilliant, deeply steeped in English literature, Shakespeare, Thackeray. He knew English history, the history of the Whig Party, better than many Englishmen. And cricket. Cricket was central to his sense of belonging to that supposedly superior tradition.
He really believed he was part of it.
He did. And his profound realization, which he articulated so powerfully later, especially in his book Beyond a Boundary, was that this identification, this striving to be English, was a fundamental mistake, a political and psychological trap.
What was the core of that realization? Why was it a mistake?
He realized that all those cultural goods of the ruling class, the literature, the history, the sportsmanship, the morality, the notions of fair play, they served ultimately only one purpose within the imperial structure. That purpose was to bind different social orders, including the educated colonial subject like himself, into an identical imperial mission. His claims to an English identity, however sincere, were functionally and politically false in the face of the brutal reality of imperialism and racism.
So the master's tools, They really couldn't dismantle the master's house. In fact, they were part of the blueprints.
That's exactly the realization. They weren't just incapable of dismantling it, they were part of the very foundation holding the house up. This wasn't just an academic insight for him, it was a deeply personal and political awakening.
And this kind of realization, writ large, propelled a massive ideological shift among many black radical thinkers in that era, didn't it? People like James, George Padmore, others. They consciously abandoned European socialist thought, particularly Marxism-Leninism, as dictated by Moscow, and turned decisively toward Pan-Africanism in the 1930s.
Yes, that period, the 1930s, was absolutely pivotal. Pan-Africanism wasn't just revived as some kind of nostalgic cultural movement. It was resurrected and reforged as a radical ideology, a unified theory of global struggle, completely distinct from and often antagonistic to the directives coming from Moscow or London or Paris.
And this disillusionment, it was driven by specific moments of betrayal, wasn't it? By the actions of European socialist and communist movements.
Absolutely. There were critical political flashpoints that really solidified the break, especially with the Communist International, the Comintern.
What were some of those flashpoints?
Well, two major events are often cited. First, the Comintern effectively disbanded the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers in 1933. This sent a clear signal that the specific struggles and priorities of black workers globally were considered subordinate to the broader, shifting strategic goals of the Soviet state and European Communist parties.
So black liberation was secondary to Soviet foreign policy needs.
That was the clear implication. But the real breaking point, the moment of profound, undeniable betrayal for many, came during the Italo-Ethiopian War in 1935-36.
Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, one of the only independent African nations at the time.
Exactly. This was seen by black people worldwide as a fundamental assault, a test case for anti-colonial solidarity. And it was then revealed that the Soviet Union, while publicly condemning Mussolini and supposedly upholding League of Nations sanctions, was actually continuing to trade crucial war materials like oil with fascist Italy.
Wow. Trading with the fascists while they were invading Ethiopia. That would have been profoundly jarring, deeply hypocritical for black radicals who saw Ethiopia's defense as the most urgent anti-colonial, anti-fascist fight of the decade.
It was an absolute betrayal, a stunning hypocrisy, and activists like James Padmore and many others recognized it instantly for what it was. They realized they simply could not rely on European comrades, communist or socialist, whose actions were ultimately dictated by Russian national interests or European power politics rather than genuine solidarity with colonial liberation.
They were forced to conclude they had to lead their own fight.
They were forced to the realization that the radical black intelligentsia was compelled by historical necessity to seek the liberation of their peoples by their own means, informed by their own history, their own theories, their own organizations. Pan-Africanism became the vessel for that independent radical project.
Now, the sources position the writer Richard Wright as uniquely qualified among this generation of intelligentsia. Why him specifically? What made him different?
Wright was seen as unique, perhaps precisely. That's Wright's huge contribution, according to this tradition. He stressed, relentlessly, that resistance occurs fundamentally in people's own cultural terms, in their language, their music, their religion, their folklore, the internal survival systems of black life under extreme pressure. His work powerfully illustrated the limits of a socialist movement that he saw as prone to too many abstractions, too much dogma, and often guilty of a kind of racial paternalism, assuming they knew what was best for black people without truly understanding their culture.
So Wright helped cement the idea that the black radical tradition wasn't just a reaction to Marxism, but something that evolved as an independent historical force in its own right.
Exactly. Distinct from Marxism, though sometimes intersecting with it. Informed fundamentally by African civilization, by centuries of collective cultural resistance, and ultimately providing what its adherents felt was a superior, more holistic framework for understanding and achieving genuine global liberation.
Okay, so this deep dive has hopefully provided a crucial revelation for you, the learner, especially if you're engaged with anti-colonial and decolonial thought. To truly grasp the black radical tradition, you have to reject that traditional Western political framework, the one that assumes colonialism or racism were just secondary issues, superstructures that would automatically crumble once the economic base was somehow fixed.
You have to reject that.
And likewise, you have to reject the notion that black resistance was somehow just an imitation, maybe a less developed version, of European class struggle. It was, instead, as we've heard, a profound, unique, and incredibly long-standing movement against a system we now have a name for: racial capitalism.
And the profound nature of that tradition, that struggle, leads us to the final, maybe difficult provocation that comes out of this intellectual positioning. This body of work strongly suggests that Western radicalism, even in its most critical forms, suffers from a critical blind spot, a kind of flight from recognizing that something more than just the obsession with property, as the source puts it, is deeply askew in the civilization itself.
Something more fundamental than just economic arrangement.
Yes. There's a suggestion of a structural pathology inherent in the culture, a culture that could not only organize, systematize, and even celebrate such brutal degradations of life, these profound violations of human destiny seen in slavery and colonialism, but a culture whose dominant liberation theories still struggle to even adequately account for them. There's something missing in the analysis.
So our final thought for you, the listener, to consider is this. Reflect on that intellectual tradition we've discussed, the one that grants supremacy to metaphysics, not the material. Think about how the goal of resistance was often, at its deepest heart, the preservation of an African people, their ontological integrity, their cultural survival, not just the immediate material goal of, say, winning higher wages or getting political representation within the existing system. How does that cultural and spiritual persistence, that focus on collective integrity over individual acquisition, continue to shape resistance today? How might it inform genuine liberation struggles across the globe, perhaps offering a model that fundamentally breaks from the often purely materialist Western paradigm?